I thought I would start by reading a piece that's about 14 years old that I wrote in my late 20s, and then that I would go on to a piece that I wrote about a month ago, and then I would finish by reading a piece from Fugue State, which is the most recent book of stories that I have. So this is a very short piece called South of the Beast, and I see it as a kind of invocation. South of the beast, he poured through the bodies, searching for occasions where, in the membrane still integumented between flesh and bone, language had become caught and not yet worked free of a corpse. In one body he found a fluster of wronged syntax, knotted in the cartilage of the knee. In another, the slick pulse of a word which at a touch split apart and grew cold before he could swallow it. He could feel the words leaking from his own body as well, and he himself grown faint and speechless, a dark grammar weeping from his side. This is a piece called Wind Eye, and was inspired by learning from Dan Macklin that one of the Old Norse words for window is vindauga, which means literally wind eye. And there's a number of parts to it. Wind Eye. 1. They lived when he was growing up in a simple house, an old bungalow with a converted attic and sides covered in cedar shake. In the back, where an oak thrust its branches over the roof, the shake was light brown, almost honey. In the front, where the sun struck it full, it had weathered to a pale gray, like a dirty bone. There, the shingles were brittle, thinned by sun and rain, and if you were careful, you could slip your fingers up under some of them, or at least his sister could. He was older, and his fingers were thicker, so he could not. Looking back on it, many years later, he often thought it had started with that, with her carefully working her fingers up under a shingle as he waited and watched to see if it would crack. That was one of his earliest memories of his sister, if not the earliest. His sister would turn around and smile, her hand gone to the knuckles, and say, "I feel something. What am I feeling?" And then he would ask questions. "Is it smooth?" he would ask. "Does it feel rough, scaly? Is it cold-blooded or warm-blooded? Does it feel red? Does it feel like its claws are in or out? Can you feel its eye move?" He would keep on, watching the expression on her face change as she tried to make his words into a living, breathing thing, until it started to feel too real for her, and half giggling, half screaming, she whipped her hand free. There were other things they did, other ways they tortured each other, things they both loved and feared. Their mother didn't know anything about it, or if she did, she didn't care. One of them would shut the other into the toy chest and then pretend to leave the room, waiting there silently until the one in the toy chest couldn't stand it any longer and started to yell. That was a hard game for him because he was afraid of the dark, but he tried not to show it to his sister. Or one of them would wrap the other tight in blankets, and then the trapped one would have to break free. Why they had liked that, why they had liked it, why they had done it, he had a hard time remembering later, once he was grown. But they had liked it, or at least he had liked it. There was no denying that. And he had done it. No denying that either. So at first those games, if they were games, then later something else, something worse, something decisive. What was it again? Why was it hard, now that he had grown, to remember? What was it called? Oh yes, Wind Eye. 2. How had it begun and when? A few years later, when the house started to change for him, when he went from thinking about each bit and piece of it as a separate thing and started to think of it as a house. His sister was still coming up close, entranced by the gap between shingle and wall, intrigued by the twist and curve of a crack in the concrete steps. It was not that she didn't know that there was a house, only that the smaller bits were more important than the whole. For him, though, it had begun to be the reverse. So he began to step back, to move back in the yard far enough away to take the whole house in at once. His sister would give him a quizzical look and try to coax him in closer, to get him involved in something small. For a while he'd play to her level, narrate to her what the surface she was touching or the shadow she was glimpsing might mean, so she could pretend. But over time he drifted out again. There was something about the house as a whole, which troubled him. But why? Wasn't it just like any other house? His sister, he saw, was standing beside him, staring at him. He tried to explain it to her, tried to put a finger on what fascinated him. This house, he told her, it's a little different. There's something about it. But he saw from the way she looked at him that she thought it was a game, that he was making it up. "What are you seeing?" she asked with a grin. Why not, he thought. Why not make it a game? "What are you seeing?" he asked her. Her grin faltered a little, but she stopped staring at him and stared at the house. "I see a house," she said. "Is there something wrong with it?" he prompted. She nodded, then looked to him for approval. "What's wrong?" he asked. Her brow tightened like a fist. "I don't know," she finally said. "The window?" "What about the window?" "I want you to do it," she said. "It's more fun." He sighed and then pretended to think. "Something wrong with the window," he said. "Or not the window exactly." Sorry about that. "Or not the window exactly, but the number of windows." He was smiling, waiting. "The problem is the number of windows. There's one more window on the outside than on the inside." He covered his mouth with his hand. She was smiling and nodding, but he couldn't go on with the game. Because, yes, that was exactly the problem. There was one more window on the outside than on the inside. That, he knew, was what he'd been trying to see. 3. But he had to make sure. He had his sister move from room to room in the house, waving to him from each window. The ground floor was all right. He saw her each time. But in the converted attic just shy of the corner, there was a window at which she never appeared. It was small and round, probably only 1.5 feet in diameter. The glass was dark and wavery. It was held in place by a strip of metal about as thick as his finger, giving the whole of the circumference a dull, leaden rim. He went inside and climbed the stairs, looking for the window himself, but it simply wasn't there. But then when he went back outside, there it was. For a time it felt like he had brought the problem to life himself by stating it, that if he hadn't said anything, the half window wouldn't be there. Was that possible? He didn't think so. That wasn't the way the world worked. But even later, once he was grown, he still found himself sometimes wondering if it was his fault, if it was something he had done, or rather said. Staring up at the half window, he remembered a story his grandmother had told him back when he was very young, just 3 or 4, just after his father had left and just before his sister was born. Well, he didn't remember it exactly, but he remembered it had to do with windows. Where she came from, his grandmother said, they used to be called not windows, but something else. He couldn't remember the word, but remembered that it started with a V. She had said the word and then had asked, "Do you know what this means?" He shook his head. He repeated the word slower this time. "This first part," she had said, "it means wind. This second part, it means eye." She looked at him with her own pale, steady eye. It is important to know that a window can instead be a wind eye. So he and his sister called it that, wind eye. It was, he told her, how the wind looked into the house, and so it was not a window after all. So of course he couldn't look out of it. It was not a window at all, but a wind eye. That's not me, I don't. He was worried she was going to ask questions, but she didn't. And then they went into the house to look again, to make sure it wasn't a window after all, but it still wasn't there on the inside. Then they decided to get a closer look. They had figured out what window was nearest to it and opened that and leaned out of it. There it was. If they leaned far enough, they could see it and almost touch it. "I could reach it," his sister said. "If I stand on the sill and you hold my legs, I could lean out and touch it." "No," he started to say, but fearless, she had already clambered onto the sill and was leaning out. He wrapped his arms around her legs to keep her from falling. He was just about to pull her back and inside when she leaned further, and he saw her finger touch the wind eye. And then it was as if she had dissolved into smoke and had been sucked into the wind eye. She was gone. 4. It took him a long time to find his mother. She was not inside the house, nor was she outside in the yard. He tried the house next door, the Jorgensens, and then the Allreds, then the Dunfords. She wasn't anywhere. So he ran back home, breathless, and somehow his mother was there now, lying on the couch, reading. "What's wrong?" she asked. He tried to explain it best he could. "Who?" she asked at first, and then said, "Slow down and tell it again." And then, "But who do you mean?" And then once he'd explained it again, she said with an odd smile, "But you don't have a sister." But of course he had a sister. How could his mother